Hi, everyone. I'm Clara, and I'm 29 years old. I grew up in a family where success was measured not by happiness, but by the number of framed degrees on your wall and the impressive digits on your paycheck. My parents, both highly respected and notoriously brilliant surgeons, had built their formidable reputation on a holy trinity: clinical precision, unattainable perfection, and unassailable prestige. Our home felt less like a sanctuary and more like a sterile extension of the hospital's executive wing, smelling of antiseptic ambition and quiet judgment. And I was always the odd one out, the splash of unpredictable color on their monochrome blueprint for a perfect life. From as early as I can remember, my parents had my entire existence meticulously mapped out, with the same care they'd use for a complex procedure. The path was unyielding: top-tier med school, a grueling residency under their watchful eyes, and finally, a named partnership in their illustrious clinic. It was a straight, sterile, and predictable path, paved not with my own dreams, but with the heavy, polished stones of expectations I never consented to carry. I'd watch them discuss my future over dinner, their conversations a script I hadn't written, and I'd feel a profound silence grow inside me. But they never noticed the girl screaming behind my compliant smile. The breaking point, or perhaps the awakening, came during my final year of undergraduate studies. The moment I finally voiced the truth, the words felt like a life sentence being commuted. "I don't want to go to medical school," I said, my voice trembling only slightly. "I want to study public health." The reaction was more profound than I had anticipated. They stared at me from across our polished mahogany dining table, their expressions a mixture of pure disbelief and dawning horror, as if I'd just announced I wanted to run away to join the circus and become a magician. "Public health?" my father repeated, the words sharp and clinical, like a scalpel making its first incision. He let the phrase hang in the air, toxic and foreign. "So, after all the private tutors, the top grades, the sacrifices, you want to waste your brilliant mind handing out pamphlets on hygiene and conducting surveys?" His voice wasn't raised, but the disappointment in it was a colder, deeper cut than any shout could ever be. My mother, ever the pragmatist, simply sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of a legacy I was seemingly throwing away. She removed her glasses, pinching the bridge of her nose as if warding off a migraine. "Clara, be reasonable," she said, her tone weary. "We didn't raise you. We didn't push you this far for mediocrity." That word, mediocrity, struck me with more force than any insult. To them, my calling was a step down, a descent into ambiguity. But to me, it was the very essence of purpose. I didn't just want to treat patients on an operating table. I wanted to understand the very roots of why they ended up there in the first place. I wanted to fight the river of sickness at its source, not just pull drowning bodies from its current. But standing there in that opulent room, surrounded by the evidence of their success, my vision of a meaningful life was one they simply couldn't and didn't see. They funded my first year of college out of a cold sense of obligation, a final bid to steer me back onto their chosen track. But when I stood my ground and steadfastly refused to switch to a pre-med track, the financial support vanished overnight. The phone call was brief and brutal. "If you're so determined to throw away the future we built for you, then you can be responsible for funding your own education." The dial tone that followed felt like a door slamming shut on my old life. So I did. I plunged into a world they had always shielded me from. I took on multiple student jobs, my days a bleary-eyed cycle of lectures, library shifts, and serving coffee with a worn-out smile. I lived in a tiny studio apartment where the lights flickered like a distressed heartbeat and the winter wind whistled through cracks in the window frames. Yet, despite the exhaustion, I finished my degree with honors, each a quiet victory that belonged only to me. After graduation, I threw myself into work at community clinics, helping underfunded neighborhoods navigate the labyrinth of healthcare to get access to basic, life-changing care. I wasn't making much, my bank account a pale shadow of Ethan's, but every day I went home bone-tired yet spiritually fulfilled. My parents called this phase wasting potential, a phrase they used like a weapon. My attempts to reconnect during holidays were always a masterclass in subtle humiliation. "Still driving that rattling old car?" my mother would ask, her gaze sweeping over my modest sedan from the pristine doorstep of their mansion. "Yes," I'd reply. "And you're still renting?" she would continue, the pause speaking volumes. "Yes, Mom." She would then take a slow, deliberate sip of her expensive wine. "We tried our best, Robert," she'd say to my father. "Some children, it seems, just inherently lack ambition." Meanwhile, my younger brother Ethan was the living embodiment of their pride. He had followed the script to the letter: med school, a prestigious residency, and a fast-tracked partnership in the family practice. He adored the spotlight, the luxury cars, the constant validation. And he never missed an opportunity, with the condescending smile, to ensure everyone knew he was the officially designated successful child. Then came the turning point, born not from their world, but from mine. After years of grassroots work, I was headhunted by a visionary public health startup focused on creating remote medical access for underserved areas. It wasn't glamorous, but its mission was revolutionary, weaving a digital infrastructure to connect small, struggling clinics across states to major hospitals. I accepted immediately, pouring all my hard-won knowledge into the role. Within 5 years, that small startup grew into the largest medical network provider in the region. When the founders retired, they named me Chief Operations Director. 2 years after that, a series of strategic moves led me to acquire majority shares. In short, I had become the silent owner of a network of hospitals, including the very one my parents' prestigious clinic depended on for its surgical rights and privileges. But they didn't know that yet. It all began to unravel during one of our painfully polished family dinners. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat and silent judgment. "So, Clara," my mother asked with saccharine sweetness, "still working at that, what do you call it, community office?" "Actually," I said, keeping my tone as even as the table surface, "we've been expanding our medical network. We recently acquired—" "That's nice, dear," she interrupted, waving a dismissive hand as if swatting a fly. "Anyway, Ethan's clinic just signed an exclusive partnership with City Care Hospital. It's a monumental deal." I simply nodded. City Care. That was one of mine. I didn't say anything. Not yet. Then came the real blow. A few weeks later, my phone buzzed with a call from my father. He sounded strained, uncomfortable, a rare crack in his composed facade. "Clara, we need to talk." He explained they were planning a major expansion of their practice, but the hospital board had unexpectedly denied their renewal request. "Something about new ownership and revised terms," he grumbled. "They're demanding a larger equity contribution and more stringent reporting." He let out a weary sigh, steeped in frustration. "Honestly, it's just corporate greed at its worst. You, in your little world, you wouldn't understand the pressures we're facing." Wouldn't I? The irony was a rich, private secret I carried with me through the following months. They started complaining more and more over our strained weekly calls, their frustrations fixated on the faceless new management, changing long-standing policies, and the paper-pushing bureaucrats who didn't know the first thing about real medicine. Every time they launched into a rant about the unreasonable demands and stifling corporate oversight, I had to bite the inside of my cheek, the taste of blood a small price to pay to stop myself from laughing at the monumental misunderstanding unfolding. They were cursing my name without ever knowing it. Then, during one particularly tense Sunday dinner, my parents made a solemn announcement. "We've reached a decision," my father said, placing his fork down with an air of grave finality. "We cannot operate under this constant uncertainty. We've decided to sell a significant portion of the practice to a group of investors. Ethan, who had been basking in his own reflected glory, suddenly frowned. Investors? Who? He asked, his voice laced with a hint of panic. A large healthcare group, my mother clarified, a tight, diplomatic smile on her face. Apparently, they are the ones who now own the hospital. They're offering an excellent deal to bring us into their fold. Though they're sending a senior representative to review our facilities and operations first. She said representative with a slight sneer, as if referring to a necessary pest. Guess who that representative was? The day of the review, I arrived at the clinic I had only ever seen from the outside as a disappointed daughter. I wore a simple, impeccably tailored black suit. No flashy jewelry, no entourage. It was just me and my quietly efficient assistant, a tablet in her hand. My parents were waiting in the sterile marble lobby, their postures rigid with a mix of stress and forced deference. They were prepared to charm a stranger. When they saw me walk through the automatic doors, my mother's face first flashed with pure, unadulterated confusion. "Clara?" she said, her voice a sharp whisper that cut through the quiet lobby. "What are you doing here? Did we get our schedules mixed up for lunch?" "I'm here for the evaluation," I said, my voice calm and even, betraying none of the seismic shift that was occurring. "The evaluation?" my father repeated, his brow furrowed in bewilderment. You work for them?" A faint dismissive hope flickered in his eyes that perhaps I was a low-level analyst sent to take notes. "Not exactly," I replied, the words hanging in the air for a moment. I didn't wait for their next question. I simply reached into my portfolio and handed each of them my stark white business card. Their eyes, trained for decades to spot the smallest detail, moved over the familiar corporate logo of the group that owned their fate. Then they froze in perfect unison on the text beneath my name. Chief Executive Officer, Horizon Health Network. The color drained from my mother's face. The clinic's success, its very survival, was tied to a hospital branch that reported directly to the Horizon Health Network. I was not just a representative. I was the final authority. You are the CEO, she whispered, the sounds barely escaping her lips. Her hand trembled slightly, the card looking suddenly heavy. You are the CEO? I am, I said quietly, holding her shattered gaze. I have been for the last 2 years. The silence that followed was the most profound sound I had ever heard. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick enough to choke on. Ethan just stood there, his mouth slightly agape, the portrait of a man whose entire worldview had just been upended. My father blinked several times rapidly, as if to try and clear a stubborn speck of dust from his vision, or perhaps to wipe away the impossible reality standing before him. But how? He finally managed to sputter, his voice stripped of its usual authority. You work with poor people. You hand out flyers and take surveys. I still work with communities in need, I corrected him gently, yet firmly. But I also now run the very system that funds the hospitals that serve them. It turns out understanding why people get sick is just as valuable as knowing how to cut the sickness out. I didn't wait for a reply. I began to walk through the hallways of their clinic. The same hallways I used to visit as a child, sitting on a cold leather bench with my coloring books while my parents discussed complex surgeries in hushed, important tones. It hadn't changed a bit. Everything was still spotless, cold, and brutally efficient, but it completely lacked the one thing they'd always accused me of having too much of: warmth. When the formal meeting concluded, I turned to face them, my expression neutral. I will approve your partnership. Their shoulders sagged with visible, premature relief, but under one condition. You will significantly expand your charity care program. A minimum of 10% of your annual operations must be dedicated to pro bono work for low-income patients. My father's face reddened instantly. That's absurd. That's not how a sustainable business is run. Then the contract is void, I said simply, with a slight shrug. The board will uphold my decision. Ethan, his financial security suddenly on the line, looked panicked. Dad, just agree, he hissed under his breath. We can't afford to lose our hospital rights. It would bankrupt us. Reluctantly, his pride visibly crumbling, my father gave a tight single nod. Fine, he bit out. Word spread through the medical community like wildfire. By the next month, everyone knew that the black sheep daughter, Clara, was the silent owner of the Horizon Health Network, the very chain that powered half of the city's elite private clinics. The whispers changed overnight, from condescending pity to reverent awe. At a charity gala later that year, my parents approached me, their demeanor suddenly unnervingly gracious. Clara, dear, my mother began, a forced smile stretching her lips. We've been meaning to say how incredibly proud we are of you. I smiled back, a polite, distant curve of my mouth. Proud of me now that I finally fit your narrow definition of success? She flushed a deep crimson. That's not fair. Neither was cutting me off financially at 19 for wanting to help people, I replied, my voice soft but clear as crystal. They had no reply. The ultimate irony came a few months later when Ethan called me, his voice tight with panic. Clara, the clinic's finances are tighter than we projected. The charity work is costly. Could we possibly get an extension on our payments to Horizon? I took a deep, measured breath. Of course, Ethan. Family comes first. He sounded profoundly relieved. Thank you, sis. You're a lifesaver. I paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. Just remember that the next time you're tempted to make a joke about my little charity career. People often ask me why I never flaunted my success, why I let them believe I was still struggling. The truth is, my grandmother, the only one who ever understood me, always said, wealth is power only when it's quiet, child. The moment you use it for validation, you lose the part of yourself that made you earn it in the first place. My parents spent their entire lives chasing prestige. I spent mine chasing purpose. And somehow, in the end, purpose built a far greater and more meaningful fortune than pride ever could. Now every time I walk through the corridors of one of our hospitals and see the hope in the eyes of the children we've helped, I feel something my parents have never understood, a profound and unshakable peace. The best revenge isn't proving them wrong, it's living right.